When negotiating for The Force Awakens, Harrison Ford allegedly insisted that he would only return to reprise the role of Space Indiana Jones if they'd agree to kill him off. Long story short, while he's very grateful for what it did for his career, he really hates all this nerd stuff, so wanted to make sure he'd never have to do it again. Now, as anybody who saw The Rise of Skywalker can attest, these things rarely stick, but nonetheless there's usually a bit of closure to be had with the lid of a casket. If you really want to bring a slice of fiction to a dignified end, your best bet remains just chucking it off a cliff, or in the case of video games, having it die a slow and drawn out death as the result of both a gunshot wound and tuberculosis. However, the reasons behind this third-person death wish aren't always narrative. Sometimes it's simply because the developers are comprehensively sick to the back arse of working on the same games with the same heroes, and they need to bury both in order to rebirth their own careers. My name is Adam Cleary, and these are 10 creators who killed video game characters so they could move on. Number 10, The Joker, Arkham City. A slight novelty this entry, as Rocksteady were more interested in having the game's players move on rather than themselves. Their Arkham series of Batman games were enjoying unprecedented levels of success, but with that came a near obsessive level of scrutiny that surrounded them and their place in the wider DC universe. Despite being a few years before the MCU pioneered the idea that everything attached to a fictional property could be in some way interconnected, Batman fans piled into message boards with theories about these new games being direct ties to assorted comic arcs and the current animated series. Principally because Mark Hamill and Kevin Conroy were both reprising their roles as the Joker and Batman respectively. Determined to drive a wedge between the games and the assorted other Bat mediums you could get at the Bat time, the decision to do something drastic was taken. Kill the Joker. From there, nobody would confuse the games with the animated series, and Rocksteady could instead plough their own narrative trench into the rich lore of the Dark Knight, which sounds a bit rude. Number 9, Lara Croft, Tomb Raider: The Last Revelation. In truth, gaming still hasn't seen a cultural phenomenon quite like Lara Croft at the turn of the millennium. At the time, consoles were still seen as the preserve of both children and layabout engineering students, but within a few years of the first Tomb Raider game, she'd been launched improbably into the mainstream. Merchandise, product endorsements, even crossover work with U2, Eidos wanted to wring every last penny they could from her. As well as making her the face of several soft drinks, this meant getting a new Tomb Raider game out every single year, with developers' core running themselves into the ground on 7 separate titles in just 6 years. Understandably, this led to severe development problems, with a burned out team struggling to meet demand. Thus, in a move that caused the sort of internal arguments not normally seen outside the goddamn McMahon family, Core killed Lara Croft in Tomb Raider: The Last Revelation. Speaking in a GameTap documentary, designer Andy Sandham said, "We attempted to kill Lara off because we really thought we'd exhausted everything we could do with the franchise. Seeing her fall down a gigantic hole in the middle of a pyramid was quite a joyous moment, so we went for a few pints to celebrate her death." Eidos, as you might expect, disagreed and had the team pump out several more installments before handing the franchise over to Crystal Dynamics. Number 8, just the entire game, Fable 2. One thing you need to know about Peter Molyneux is that when he is Peter Molyneux, he is very Peter Molyneux. Even when he's not though, even on say a quiet Sunday where there are absolutely no tasks that feel even a little bit Peter Molyneux-y to be done, he is still incredibly Peter Molyneux. Your most Peter Molyneux-esque friend is at best only about 1/8 as Peter Molyneux as Peter Molyneux. One of his most Peter Molyneux moments though, and this is in just such a rich history of incredibly Peter Molyneux moments, was when he tried to murder Fable 2 just so people would stop asking him what happened to the features that were promised for it. While doing promotional work for Fable 3, he would happily tell anyone who asked, and everyone who didn't, what a disaster he thought its predecessor had been, calling it rushed and rubbish with over 67,000 bugs where 40% of all the content didn't get used and all the women looked like Russian shot putters. All this to distance himself from the suggestions that both he and the studio had failed to deliver what had been promised, in the hope that we'd all just move on. Number 7, Desmond, Assassin's Creed Revelations. When you think about the critical popularity and commercial success of the early Assassin's Creed games and how prominent a role their primary protagonist played in all of them, it's bizarre that Desmond Miles is not really considered one of the biggest video game characters in history. He's just sort of there. Ubisoft intended for his to be a story about living up to a legacy and how an ordinary man can in fact wind up being as big a hero as any historical assassin. It's a nice idea, but they set his ordinariness up so well that by the time Assassin's Creed Revelation rolled around, he just felt like a loser who they'd be unable to convincingly continue to build a narrative around. Simply switching focus to someone else would have been a bit jarring with Desmond still out there, so Ubisoft elected to cut their losses and just kill him off entirely. They gave him a heroic death, one arguably befitting the arc they'd originally laid out for him, and just hoped fans would happily move on in the following games. And I mean, they did, even if the game's bugs didn't. Number 6, Commander Shepard, Mass Effect. Question: what do you do when you neatly plan out an at most 3-game story arc centering around a central protagonist, but find yourself so critically successful you know both fans and studio owners with nice ties will be literally kicking your front gate open to talk you into making a 4th? Well, and this is admittedly a very obvious answer given the headline of the video here, you kill off said central protagonist. Then if they really want that 4th game, they're going to have to let you come up with something new and profound rather than messing up your wonderful story. Shepard's story was always intended to be a trilogy, and BioWare made sure it stayed that way. When Mass Effect Andromeda rolled around a few years later, despite the fact it took place prior to his death, they were able to leave the Commander out entirely, thus enabling a new gameplay format that moved away from the Paragon Renegade morality system that had come to define both the initial 3 installments and Shepard himself. Number 5, Manny, Grim Fandango. Yeah, it's not technically accurate to say that Manny is killed at the end of Grim Fandango. It's more the case that he simply enters a better level of being dead, but either way, the closing segments comprehensively wrap up his story as he departs for the afterlife. It became such a beloved cult title that any story even remotely related to changes at LucasArts, and my god, there have been a lot of them, would invariably descend into someone wriggling their eyebrows, grinning from ear to ear, and muttering, Grim Fandango sequel? The answer remains, as it always has done, a big flat nope. The reason for that is the same reason that the ending of the original game was so decisive for Manny, and it's simply that designer Tim Schafer doesn't like making sequels. If there were 5 of me, he famously said to notoriously cerebral gaming publication Playboy, I might make sequels, but there's always some new idea I want to explore instead. We can argue the toss all day about whether or not Manny actually dies in this game, but undeniably, Tim Schafer's desire to make a sequel did. Number 4, Wesker, Resident Evil 5. Throughout the Resident Evil franchise, Albert Wesker would appear, get killed, and then reappear in the next game, having faked his death or been miraculously saved, or that wasn't him, that was Balbert Besker or something. All apparently at the behest of the Capcom bigwigs, really just liking the character. So in Resident Evil 5, the developers dumped him into a volcano and shot him in the face with 2 missile launchers so they'd never ever have to use him in another game. That's it, there's no more to the story than that, just video games' one and only example of a developer eyeballing a producer and doing the dodge this bit from the Matrix. Number 3, Dell and/or JD, Gears of War 5. For years and 4 installments of the core games, Gears of War was a story about a load of really big lads running around doing really big lad stuff and chainsawing anybody who told them to stop being such really big lads. Their entire aesthetic being that of an American footballer if the pads were designed by one heavy metal Warhammer 40k player from about 500 years in the future. In the first 3 games of the trilogy, you primarily play as Marcus, really big lad Phoenix, before Gears 4 transitions to his son, JD RBL Phoenix. The game follows largely the same narrative of horrible things breaking through the ground and attempting to crush all the humans, only for a group of lads, really big ones I might add, to step in and save the day. Now if you think I've done that really big lad thing to death there, then you're about halfway to understanding how the developers felt. They loved this world they'd made and the stories they could tell in it, but having all their protagonists be these gravel-voiced mega dudes with dumps like a truck was wearing a bit thin. Thus, from Gears of War 5, they made Kate the central focus, and to show you they were serious, had you choose which of our really big lad friends dies at the end. Number 2, Master Chief, Halo 3. Was Master Chief dead? Well, the time we last saw him in a Bungie game, he was floating lifelessly through space, and when it came to make the next installment in the franchise, he was left out entirely, so yeah? I mean, I didn't, personally go into my Xbox and take a pulse or anything, but he certainly wasn't alive in any sense that counted. But why would Bungie, the makers of the Halo franchise, want to write out one of modern gaming's most iconic and marketable characters? Well, the long answer is because after pouring years of their lives and hundreds of thousands of man-hours into one successful franchise, they felt the time was right to expand their creative horizons and pursue a new project that would push both the bounds of their imagination and challenge them to make the next great game. The short answer is that they came up with the idea for Destiny and decided that sounded a lot more fun than making Halo 4. Number 1. Solid Snake, Metal Gear Solid 4. During the production of Metal Gear Solid 2, Hideo Kojima began to take a step down from the franchise to focus on other projects. Then, during the production of Metal Gear Solid 3, a string of developmental issues led to him coming back in to oversee the project. Before all this, and literal death threats from fans, what caused him to come back on board for 4? By this point, with Snake now old, grey, tired, and constantly getting dragged back from the grave for one last mission, Kojima began to see a lot of himself in the legendary character. He wanted to move on with his life, but his connection to the man in the sneaking suit constantly stopped that from happening. Thus, at the end of MGS4, he opted to quietly kill him off screen. Wait, what's that you spray all over the nearest cardboard box? Snake doesn't die in MGS4, he just quietly fades to white, surrounded by daisies in a cemetery. Oh dear. Now look, if you're still not convinced, then just listen to this quote from some anonymous Metal Gear Solid fan. The hidden theme in this game is that I really want Snake to die so that I can move on with my life. So there you have it, those are 10 creators who killed video game characters so they could move on. Read to you by a man for whom violence is never the answer, he just mutes people on Twitter instead. Let me know what you made of it all in the comments below. Of course, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. I have, of course, been Adam Cleary. And I'll see you soon. Goodbye.